Hey there guys, today we're taking a look at Forza Horizon 5 running on the AMD RX 564GB paired with the Ryzen 7 1700. Now this is currently running the in-game benchmark at 1080p at the highest preset because that's what it defaulted to. So I figured, well, let's run through and try out all of the different game modes. I would say that at the highest preset this was definitely very wrong. The performance is not great, you can tell by those 1% lows. And it's really just hardly a playable experience. We're barely above 30 frames per second. If it wasn't for the frame time stutter that will sometimes happen, I would say that this would be playable at 30 frames per second. But it's one of those things that when you're doing some really intense races, you're going to notice the stutter and it's going to kind of ruin the experience. So I would say tone it down a bit to medium if you want to play at a consistent 30. Because then you're eliminating any potential stutter. You'll see that the 1% lows are slowly recovering. There was really just one major stutter at the beginning, but even then throughout the race you can't really see it here, but trying the overworld at this setting was kind of a pain, especially when loading in new areas and stuff like that. So the benchmark here is a little misleading in showing that like high settings isn't completely awful. I would say it is kind of completely awful, but it's usually when you're driving in the open world. You can see right here what the final results were and what all of the settings are. Resolution scaling is on, but it's set to ultra quality. We'll actually try that at a lower setting later on, but you'll see just shy of 40 frames per second, so 39 frames on average was what we achieved here. Not exactly the greatest experience. Moving over to the medium preset though, you'll see that the performance numbers really start to look better here, and I think this is where you want to be at if you want to play this at 30 frames per second. Again, we're still in that 40 territory, but you're giving yourself the headroom where you will almost never go below that 30 frames per second average. The overworld is a lot more playable like this. I would say that this is really where you want to go for if you want to have that 30 frames per second experience. If you want to leave your frame rate unlocked though, I would still suggest just leaving the settings then at medium or lower, because of the fact that you can get away with this. The experience isn't the worst. I mean, racing games can be kind of forgiving on frame rate sometimes, but really it just depends on what you tolerate, and I think having a more consistent 30 is going to give you a more consistent experience than having it just fluctuate like this, especially if you don't have a FreeSync monitor. Now I have a FreeSync monitor, so because of that, this is completely playable. This is perfectly fine. You know, FreeSync is going to do its thing. It's going to sync up all the frames. Not really going to notice as much of the fluctuation. But if you don't have FreeSync, that 30 frames per second lock is there to save the day. Overall, I would say that medium is really where it starts to just become playable, and it really comes down to what kind of frame rate you want to get. As you can see, settings that we used, ultra quality resolution scaling is still enabled, and with that we're able to just break past the 40 FPS barrier, getting that 46 average. Now, going at the low settings, this is where performance starts to pick up, but it's still not enough that I would say that if you're going to be going for low settings, you might as well go to the ultra low settings, or the very low settings rather, because the FPS starts to just creep up there enough that you're getting close to consistent 60 FPS. The 1% lows are looking really, really good, and the quality of the game really isn't altered too much. At the end of the day, you could play this game at the lowest settings or the highest settings. You're gonna have an enjoyable experience, and I feel like having the smoothest driving experience is really more important than just having the most beautiful looking vehicle. That being said, if quality does matter a lot to you, again, you can always turn up the quality, drop the FPS down to 30, and you'll have a consistent experience there. Really, at this point, what I would suggest doing, instead of just lowering the resolution, or rather lowering the settings all the way down, is to actually mess with the resolution scaling. So instead of having it at ultra quality, maybe dropping down to quality, maybe dropping down to balanced, or straight up just performance, just to see what kind of improvement you get versus, you know, just dropping all the settings down. As you can see here, again, This is that low preset with the ultra quality resolution scaling, and we're at 55 at this point. We are just 5 FPS away from getting a consistent 60. So dropping everything down to the lowest preset, you'll see FPS average, we are finally hitting that 60 mark. Of course, we're dropping below that, but those 1% lows are also looking very, very good. Very, very close to what our average is, what our FPS is at. Overall, this is a solid performance number right here. And the resolution scaling is really one of the biggest heroes here because of the fact that while it doesn't have FSR, it has the predecessor to that, which is the AMD CAS upscaling. And it does a fine job, if you ask me. I feel like more games should have had that feature. Yes, it doesn't look amazing. It doesn't look as good as FSR. And you can definitely make the argument that FSR is nowhere near DLSS. But the fact that it exists is better than pretty much not being able to play the game at all, because there's so many games that get saved by, FSR or the CAS upscaling because of the fact that you're able to just render the game at a resolution that the GPU can actually support properly, and it doesn't really ruin the image as much as you would expect, especially when you're playing the actual game. I personally don't really pay attention to things like textures and stuff like that unless it's like an ultra sightseeing game. Like Skyrim is one of those games where if you load it up with the visual mods and all that, you want to stare at rocks for a while. But once you get past the whole staring at rocks phase, it doesn't really matter too much. And you can see 71 FPS. That's pretty fantastic. Now, throwing in one final test here. This is at the lowest preset with the CAS upscaling set to performance. And you'll definitely notice a lot of shimmering. It looks like we need AA in this image. So there's definitely a visual impact. But I gotta say, playing on the laptop screen, I don't really notice this too much. I'm so focused on just driving the car while playing. Obviously, this is a benchmark, so the benchmarks here were just run as a comparison's sake for the other settings, but I actually played the game like this just to see what it would be like. Honestly, on a laptop screen, this is a 14-incher. I don't really notice too badly. You're gonna see the shimmering if you look for it, but if you just want to play the game at a really high FPS, you can do it like this, which is why I say if you're like at medium, or if you're at, the low settings, instead of dropping down to very low, mess around with the CAS upscaling. Maybe, I mean, this is at performance. This is like as ugly as you can get it. I personally don't find any issues with the ultra quality. Dropping down to quality, it really starts to get super subjective there. It's really not until you drop down all the way to the best performance that you'll be like, okay, yeah, there is a noticeable reduction here. And it's really just up to you whether or not you can stomach that. Personally, I have no issues with this. I wouldn't play like this because I think that the performance at ultra low, or very low rather, was good enough. But I mean, we got to 80. So this option is here if you just want to mess around with things.